Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and if you are listening to us on one of the many fine podcast platforms at which you can find us, you can check out what's happening in our studio by going to YouTube. If you are watching us on YouTube, we are available to go with you wherever you want to go, wherever you find your fine podcast content or even your not so fine podcast content. You can find us there. Please hit the subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment, and spread the word about it. Let your friends and family members and your family members' friends know all about how much you're enjoying the lunch hour. Looking forward to my chat with my guest today. We had a wonderful time sitting on a panel together at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in February. His name is Guy Bentley. He is the Director of Consumer Freedom Research at the Reason Foundation, where he specializes in policies related to tobacco harm reduction, vaping regulations, and consumer choice. His research focuses on the economic and public health impacts of government intervention in personal lifestyle choices, advocating for evidence-based policymaking, as you would expect from an entity like Reason. Prior to joining Reason, Guy was a journalist covering public policy in both the U.S. and the U.K. His work has been featured in major outlets, and he is a recognized expert on the intersection of regulation, public health, and personal freedom. And of course, the motto of Reason and Reason Magazine is free minds, free minds, free choices?
Free minds, free markets.
Free minds, free markets. Good Lord. I'm going to have my Reason card revoked. Free minds, free markets. Of course, it's an important philosophy. I mean, let me ask you this, just sort of get started there, Guy. How did you wind up linking up with the good folks at Reason, the foundation? How did you sort of come to that?
Well, it goes way back when, really to 2013, when I was actually doing an internship on the magazine side, really just shortly after I got out of college. And I was on the magazine side. And ironically enough, the now managing editor of the magazine was also interning in the same program, but on the foundation side, so the more public policy side.
Got it.
And I really enjoyed, journalism. I liked being a journalist for a while. But I sort of came to a time where I really wanted to get into the public policy angle and really advocate for the policies, evidence-based policies, as you say, that I thought could increase freedom, prosperity, and well-being, rather than commenting or covering on it. I don't think I was going to make much good of an objective journalist for long. So I did what I thought was the right thing and crossed the wire into think tank land.
It's interesting because I think I may have said this to you in the past. I am guided in my policy work by the language in a 1992 Supreme Court decision, New York versus United States, in which Justice O'Connor said, "The Constitution protects us from our own best intentions. It divides power among sovereigns and among branches of government precisely so that we might resist the temptation to concentrate power in one location as the expedient solution to the crisis of the day." And obviously writing that in 1992, so 33 years ago, the issue of crisis-driven policy, it was obviously weighing heavily on Justice O'Connor's mind. This is something that has continued, I'm going to say, largely unabated, even with this Supreme Court decision out there. Talk about the problems of policy made in a crisis and how it is the opposite of data-driven policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the most human things that, can possibly happen. If we think of our own personal lives, our natural instincts of panic and overreaction to whatever problems we might face, politicians and regulators are not immune from this, particularly when there is a crisis, something comes up, and then they need to be seen to react to their constituents, and often will reach for the first thing off the shelf that might be from a popular narrative. Something must be done. This is something, therefore we will do it. And we've seen this, in so many areas, whether it comes to, gun regulation, food regulation, things like vaping regulation. I think one of the, much underreported, but one of the biggest crises we had, and I think it presaged a lot with what went on with the response to COVID, which was another massive, disastrous area of public policy, was just before the COVID crisis happened, you might remember there was it was on the news for several weeks. It ran on and on and on. There was an outbreak of what were called sort of vaping related lung injuries.
100%. Hold on.
Absolutely.
Wait a second, guy. Let me set the stage here because I was fortunate at the time to be teaching on the regulatory process at a major university. And in my class, it was one of those things. We had a whole class about this, about the panic and how that should inform. Go ahead and talk about this.
Absolutely. And particularly interesting that you were teaching a class because it was particularly concentrated amongst young people.
Right.
And obviously, e-cigarettes have grown massively. I've been a huge advocate for them as a safer alternative to smoking. So when these illnesses and injuries started cropping up, which we had never seen anywhere else in the world, everyone thought, what's going on here? Why has this never happened before? It's the same product, same constituents. But when we started getting the data in, it was very quickly apparent that what was happening was it wasn't the nicotine e-cigarettes that you would get at a 7-Eleven or, at a vape shop or wherever. What they were illicit marijuana THC cartridges that had been tainted with something called vitamin E acetate. And then people were inhaling this substance, getting very seriously ill, and some people dying. And interestingly enough, when we ran an analysis of it, we found that the lung injuries were particularly concentrated in states where marijuana was illegal.
Interesting.
But instead of looking at all that, the CDC recommended that everyone just stop vaping altogether, which is terrible if you're a smoker trying to quit smoking.
Right.
So many people went back to cigarettes. And now most people today think e-cigarettes are just as or more dangerous than cigarettes, the opposite of the truth. And a lot of that was thanks to the CDC's overreaction.
It's so funny you use the word truth because I remember in the 1990s, I've never been a smoker. Occasionally I might have a cigar with friends, was never a cigarette smoker, was never a vapor, never tried marijuana. But nevertheless, I understood the issues of personal freedom and choice. And there was in the 90s this relentless campaign by some group called Truth, and it was a massive anti-tobacco campaign. And then obviously about 5-6 years ago, they switched over to being anti-vaping, and it was a whole thing. And it was like, well, wait a minute. I mean, you were anti-tobacco beforehand. We know the relationship between vaping and how that can change whether or not someone smokes cigarettes. And yet now I was going to use an off-color term. You're going to defecate on this other alternative. Let's talk about that. But I also want to talk about the issue of risk and comparative risk assessment as a general issue. But let's talk about sort of the moral panic and the issue of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. We've known that coming on for a couple decades now, that a range of nicotine alternatives have entered the market, whether it's nicotine pouches or vapes, heated tobacco products that have just entered the market. And one of the things that is exciting about these is that they're essentially a consumer-driven, innovation-led response to a public health problem. We all know, I used to be quite a heavy smoker. Nicotine patches and gums would never work for me. Right. So having these things that are much more satisfying, where you get the nicotine, which is key to understand, is not the harmful part of smoking. It's very much the addictive part, but it's not the harmful part. If you can get the nicotine you want without the smoke that can kill you, that's a great benefit to public health and consumer choice. But unfortunately, many people like Truth Initiative, who you have mentioned, they now see the problem of, well, we're getting smoking rates down. That should be a great benefit. Maybe we can close down business, right? Yeah. But unfortunately, they now have moved on to wanting a nicotine-free society rather than a smoke-free society. So it's mission creep like we see with so many government agencies, public health campaign pressure groups. And unfortunately, it's the same case here.
It's the justification, right? You're successful in the one regard. You are an organization that exists to, I'm going to say it, make money off of a moral panic, even though you're a nominal nonprofit organization. Well, you get whatever, your target is shut down, and then you switch over to another moral panic. Actually, before you comment on that, we may come back to that in a second, because you've done a lot of work on the policy side of this. One of the things that I've dealt with over the years in terms of trying to better inform regulatory policy is this issue of comparative risk assessment. The idea of when we offer up a regulatory policy proposal, we do a very bad job at assessing the unintended consequences and the risks that ensue from those unintended consequences. And one of the examples I like to use is, we have this and this may not be in your area of expertise, but you'll follow the example. We have a company wants to cite a petrochemical refining facility in a community. And the environmental justice crowd comes in and says, well, no, you can't do this because this is going to double the cancer risk from 2 in 100,000 to 4 in 100,000, right? Just from the exposure to the various chemicals. Well, somebody else can come in and say, well, wait a minute, that's not necessarily the case, because you're giving people jobs, you're giving people access to better health care, you're getting people access to better food, you're actually going to have the cancer risk from 2 in 100,000 to 1 in 100,000. We do a very bad job at sort of comparing the risks of this. But, and is it because of we have a lack of a data-driven society? Is it just too hard to do? I mean, again, back to the vaping versus smoking, tobacco products. I mean, again, there's a risk versus risk trade-off here that we're very bad at looking at, aren't we?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I find that it's not so much we live in a society with a lack of data. In many areas, in fact, I think, we can almost say we have data overload.
Sure.
I think there are inherent biases when we come to look at real rigorous cost benefit analysis. If we look at the Biden administration in so many ways, I mean, your example I think was very fruitful to think about, and across so many areas, particularly in the climate legislation realm, we would massively undercount the costs and overestimate the benefits of these kind of regulations.
In fact, it was inculcated into the OMB's guidance document, Circular A6. That you would massively overestimate the benefits, including benefits to people outside of the United States, and then narrow the costs. And it's an insane way. It's one of the things we've asked the Trump administration to come in and look at. One of my favorite examples during the Biden administration, which I think would appeal to you. I don't know if you were following at all, Guy, the ethylene oxide discussion. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not.
So the EPA came out with a proposed standard on something called ethylene oxide, which is a gas. And it is a gas that is used to disinfect medical equipment, medical devices, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have a certain level of exposure to ethylene oxide, there's a likelihood you may get cancer, or some folks may get cancer. The problem is you cannot have a medical procedure in the United States without having at least one device or piece of equipment disinfected with ethylene oxide, because it for things that have to be heated or things that can't be heated or things that can't be sterilized with alcohol, you have to use this gas in order to do it, and it's reused, and it's a whole thing. And the EPA did not come up with an alternative to all of this as they went down this road. So, again, you talk about a risk versus risk, right? The minimal risk of somebody getting cancer from, even average exposure to ethylene oxide versus the risk of harm from not being able to disinfect properly all of the pieces of equipment or devices in medical theater. This is what we're talking about here, the lack of sort of foresight in this, aren't we?
That's absolutely right. And particularly when you look at the area of fossil fuels, because I mean, when you're talking about fossil fuels, the benefits of fossil fuel use, almost everything in society runs on fossil fuels, from clothing to medicine to, agriculture, everything. The benefits are so large, they're almost incalculable. So putting them in a risk reward trade-off, absolutely, for certain
100%.
pollutants and so on, perhaps certain standards can pass that test, but it's a very difficult one to tread. And hopefully, I think, as you suggest, with the new administration having a much more rigorous focus on cost benefit analysis and on net deregulation, hopefully we can see some kind of change to what we saw over the last 4 years.
Yeah, I'm having a brain freeze on the plasticizers debate, right? The stuff that makes plastic soft and the work to ban that. And again, the lack of a, I want to say like DHA, BHA, whatever it is that goes into plastic bottles to make them soft, and the work to ban that. I mean, again, it sort of gets into this, the expense, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all of these things. Do you have hope? You can sort of put on your prognostication hat. I mean, do you have hope that we're going to get better at driving this science in the coming administration? I'm certainly hopeful about this, but want to get your thoughts here.
I'm enormously hopeful. I
Yeah.
think there's a ton of smart people in the administration at OIRA and OMB and throughout the agencies who have thought about this stuff for many, many years. I think you and I will have been reading a lot of these folks coming
Oh, yeah.
into the administration for a bunch of times. And it's not just, conservatives or libertarians or right wingers who are really putting the laser focus on the administrative state and so on. Even Cass Sunstein, one of President Obama's,
Oh, yeah.
favorite regulatory czars, in an interview he did with Vox many years ago. I think you'll enjoy this and to look it up. He was being interviewed by this Vox reporter. He said, "Well, but if we do cost benefit analysis in the way you're saying, won't that mean that there'll be a lot of deregulation and conservatives will stop a lot of regulation?" And Cass Sunstein just replied, "Well, if it does, then it means that the conservatives are right."
Yeah.
And so, if you actually do this kind of analysis. So I am hopeful. I'm really hopeful. So, fingers crossed.
Listen, when I talk about comparative risk assessment, it's in no small measure because Cass Sunstein, before he became a wire administrator, was wrote a book about it, and it's on my shelf. It's one that my dad recommended to me because this is stuff that my dad has worked on over many years. I mean, let's sort of talk about the other impulse, though. The problem with big brothering on the other side of the issue, and we're seeing this. On the issue of nutrition standards. It's what we talked about. We talked about it with regards to alcohol. In fact, something, let's talk about alcohol first and nutrition guidelines out there, and then we'll get into the SNAP beverage issue or the SNAP issue in beverages. But let's talk about the alcohol issue and the guidance that was being put out that said there's no safe serving of alcohol. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. There has been, for the epidemiology around alcohol and alcohol consumption, for many decades, we've known there's what we call a J curve in terms of mortality, which means that people who don't drink at all die earlier than people who drink moderately, and people who drink a lot die earlier than both of those kinds of people.
Yeah.
We've seen this for many decades. It's been studied, to eons of length. Now, there has been a campaign pushed by a few academics from Canada, and in the United Kingdom and the World Health Organization to change our recognized dietary guidelines, saying that, for men, 2 drinks a day is okay. For women, 1 drink a day. That kind of moderate drinking is not going to significantly harm you and impact your health. There has been a campaign to say exactly as you suggest, there is no safe level of alcohol, which is completely unscientific, as the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine released a doorstopper of a report in 2024 saying, no, what we've known for decades, moderate alcohol consumption is perfectly within reason. You can live a healthy lifestyle with moderate alcohol consumption. But now, hopefully, again, we will see what the new dietary guidelines says, but I think it would be quite ridiculous if they go along with this route of saying there is zero safe level of alcohol.
But what drives this? I mean, here's the thing that gets me, right? I mean, listen, I understood this. I found it surprising, back 2013, 2014 timeframe, when it was the Obama administration under Operation Choke Point that was going after, among other things, adult entertainers, right? They were going after payday lending and gun and ammunition manufacturers and dealers. And then, weirdly enough, porn. And they were doing this because there were some folks who in the leftist sectors who believe that porn is anti-feminist and it's abusive to women, whatever. I don't understand the political guidance. I mean, is there a new temperance movement? I mean, do we have who is the new Carrie A. Nation who is out there, with an axe busting open kegs of lager? I mean, what is driving this?
I mean, a lot that's driving it is taxpayer money. And there absolutely is a new temperance movement. The rivers of cash that go from NIH and the CDC and so on to universities to essentially fund, in brackets, public health. But this isn't public health as we'd recognize it, getting rid of cholera or
Right, of course.
contagious disease, which, we're all in favor of, safe drinking water, all the rest of it.
Right.
This is essentially looking at our lifestyle choices, looking at how much you smoke, vape, drink, eat,
Perfect,
gamble. Yeah. And that is all. We have entire academic departments, Johns Hopkins and others, essentially writing policy papers on why the government should tax you more and restrict your lifestyle choices.
But so it's sort of couched in this idea of I mean, this is the problem. right? It's so funny. Nick Gillespie and I used to have this conversation because he and I both debated a woman on Fox named Mimi Roth. Actually, I think he debated her elsewhere. I used to debate her on Fox, who was in favor of putting a fat stamp in people's medical portfolios. And obviously, the more the government, but more the U.S. taxpayers pay for more people's health care, the more danger of this and the intrusive nature of this as an affront to personal freedom. But it seems to me that's the same kind of thinking that is at work here. That the more, and it gets into the issue of now the SNAP benefits issue and entitlement spending, and whether or not the government should be in the business of doing this. There's a slippery slope here at work. I know I'm sort of dancing around this, Guy, but your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I think the point you make about the more we collectivize healthcare, then suddenly your lifestyle becomes my business is an important one. Because the UK has socialized medicine,
Yeah.
we see every debate in the newspapers about what to regulate, what foods to tax or ban or anything else like that. The argument is always made, well, it's not your choice because I pay for your healthcare.
Right.
And it would be a real shame to let that kind of thinking emerge in the United States. Because even if we look into the actual numbers and figures on it, it's not true. But also, we want to stop that before it happens. It is ridiculous that we should all be micromanaging each other's, dietary decisions or alcohol intake or whatever,
Right.
just because the government has decided that there are some collective provision of healthcare.
That's I guess what I'm getting at here. There's a real slippery slope at work. In the panel that we had, Gabriella Hoffman was talking about the issue of nutrition standards and climate change. You were talking about climate change just a moment ago. This idea that we start banning what folks can. Setting aside, actually, we should talk about the public policy implications here and the costs that are at work. But the idea that we can sort of make this justification because someone's paying for it, it's like what would prevent the Tim Walz administration or the Gavin Newsom administration from coming in and saying, well, something, there are public health impacts of people eating red meat. And yes, it's bad for the environment. Therefore, we're going to sharply limit people's purchasing of red meat, or, even a step back from that, right? Hot dogs or ramen noodles, right? If you're someone who is on a fixed income, you may have a diet that consists of hot dogs and ramen noodles. And all of a sudden we're going to now restrict these things. That's the slippery slope we're talking about here. There are huge problems, aren't there, with that?
There absolutely are. And also, when you make a slippery slope argument, people say, oh, well, it's a logical fallacy that, X doesn't lead to Y. But working in the field that I do for as many years, the slippery slope is not a logical fallacy. It's almost an inevitability.
Absolutely.
And look at the language people use when they're talking about interventions in people's dietary habits, climate change, and so on. It's always equated to the tobacco industry.
Yes.
It's always said, we did this with cigarettes. Let's do it with alcohol, red meat, and so on. And this is what, people were warning about many years ago, that if you give the government this kind of license, actors and private interest groups, political parties will latch onto it and use it for things other than the original purposes of reducing smoking.
Something you raise a really good point, and it's some of the good work that Reason does on the issue of cronyism, right? The larger the government is, the more power government has to make these decisions. It's so funny. Real quick, I'm going to digress, and this is a conversation I need to have with some of your colleagues as well at the magazine. I'm watching the latest season of 1923. Have you ever watched the show, any of the Taylor Sheridan shows?
I've watched the first 3 episodes. Great show.
Okay. First 3 episodes of the first season of 1923?
First season.
So at the beginning of the second season, we watched the first episode last night. We're very much behind the curve on this. There were 2 moments in which they were discussing what I would ostensibly call Randian. And not that Reason is an objectivist organization. I know they're not. I want to be really clear about this. But at one point, talking about how the more that government does for people, the less they're going to act in their own behalf. There was that aspect of it. There was another mention yesterday or in the show about it as well. And I guess I bring this up because the more here's my point, right? The more we give government license to do these things, the more that they will. And now I completely lost the thread here, Guy, and I apologize for that. The point at the end of the day is that these things inevitably lead to others. I'm sorry. Go ahead and sort of react to the expand on the idea of government expansion sort of leading to all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
As I try to find my train of thought.
Well, and also to put in another Taylor Sheridan plug, if anyone hasn't seen Landman, they absolutely should.
Of course, 100%.
Landman, absolutely. That's my favorite of all the Taylor Sheridan.
Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. I'm so excited to see it's renewed for a second season. But onto the actual point.
Yeah.
I think you're exactly right. In terms of taking agency away from people in that sort of Obama-esque Life of Julia stuff that we saw many years ago in the cradle to grave, the state and the government is always going to be there for you to solve some problem or remedy some action you've made incorrectly. That absolutely does displace, our sort of, sense of willpower and the automatic responses we have to take care of ourselves and our families. It displaces churches, families, individuals, and communities to look after each other. And those are the actual basic building blocks to build self-reliance. We have that within the family, and to build self-discipline. We cannot have government agencies and bureaucrats in remote places managing our lives for us, because these people, even with the best of intentions, that's not a way you can live your life, lead an independent life, and decide what is best for you, particularly in the most basic and social things like what we consume, how we eat, how we cook for ourselves. We are not going to have the government cooking and preparing our meals for us or shopping for us. If we can't master that ourselves, keep ourselves healthy and fit, and have conversations with each other about how to manage our own way to nutrition and so on, we really are very far away from being an independent and free people.
As someone who fundamentally changed his diet in the last 11 months and lost a considerable amount. Listen, any of you guys go back and look. If you're listening to us on the pod, the MP3 portion of the podcast platforms, go and look at over the last year. Go and look at episodes that I recorded prior to, let's say, May or June of 2024, and look at them now. You can see the stark difference in how I look. You can make those choices, make those changes yourself. One of the things that I'm reminded of, get your comment on this. I used to say, and this gets into the issue of it's very difficult to change policy directions once you go down a road. Part of the reason why we have a deliberative system. The most well-intentioned policies eventually bump up against very real realities. Or as my father more succinctly and more eloquently put it, Andrew, there are many roads to utopia. However, all must traverse the surface of the earth, right? Reality intrudes in some very interesting ways when we start to create these expanded policies, don't they, Guy?
They absolutely do. And that's because, especially if they're being administered, particularly at the federal level by a federal agency, we all know that, federal agencies and certain programs will never close themselves. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier with mission creep.
Yes.
With certain particular agencies. You set out to solve one problem, and perhaps you ameliorate or solve the problem, but then somehow you discover a whole range of new problems to be solved or interfered with. And these agencies, we think about so many, particularly over the COVID, essentially large-scale public policy mistake in its recommendations, how these policies build upon each other. Think about the closure of schools and mask mandates. We said children are resilient; they will be totally fine with at-home learning. We have all this newfangled tech that means that you don't actually have to be in a classroom. What a complete disaster that was. And we thought we would be saving lives. Well, in fact, there's no evidence this actually on net save lives. And we can do that by looking at cross-country comparisons. See who did what for how long, when, and we unthinkingly went along with this. So I think humility is the point you're really getting at.
It's so
really
funny.
Humility.
I had this conversation. I was a lobbyist for the National Federation of Independent Business in the early 2000s. And at a time we were talking about bird flu, I had a conversation with HHS. it was called in. They were trying to put together their playbook that they could pull off the shelf. And they said, okay, well, what would happen to small businesses if we shut down the economy for 2 weeks? Swear to God, hand to God, literally 2007, 2008, that time frame, I was asked about this. And I said, okay, you shut down the economy for 2 weeks. The businesses are going to go under. My members are going to go under. And they were shocked. They're like, well, wait a minute, only 2 weeks. I'm like, yeah, you don't understand the margins on which these businesses operate. Anyway, the point is we were warning about this. Let's shift gears a little bit. I think most of my listeners and viewers are familiar with Reason. Let's talk a little bit more about how you got involved with them. Actually, before we get there, I do have another question about this, because I just had a conversation with Fred de Fassard from the Prosperity Institute. And we were talking about UK and how the UK approaches regulation, especially in the post-Brexit world. They don't have an Administrative Procedure Act like we do here, notice and comment rulemaking. It's a very different, not ad hoc. But what are your impressions on the difference between how the US regulates and how they regulate in the UK, and where we might learn from them in terms of improving on, if we could improve, given that?
Yeah. I think it's tough because they are such different systems.
Yeah.
A parliamentary versus a presidential system. Essentially, what goes through Parliament is Parliament's will. We don't have as much of the sort of third branch administrative state as the United States does. We do have regulatory bodies such as Ofcom, which regulates broadcasting, a lot of the technology sector, and so on, which actually has been doing a pretty terrible job, to be honest. The problem with the UK is that the UK post-Brexit does have a lot of regulatory freedom. One of the great reasons for Brexit was to have a less regulated economy, not to have all these European Union rules that are, I think you've probably spoken with so many guests about this, hammering innovation in Europe. Look at the American economy and the European economy. We don't see great startups really emerging, or medical innovation emerging really from Europe. And that's because of European Union, to a large part, European Union regulation, like the Clinical Trials Directive.
Absolutely.
The UK has an opportunity to diverge from that, but both the previous government and this current government is not taking it. They're trying to be in what we call regulatory alignment with the European Union.
Yes.
And they're just undermining one of the biggest benefits of Brexit, which is the whole point is to diverge, experiment, try and get an innovative edge over the European Union. We have great universities in Oxford and Cambridge. The biosciences sector in the UK, the pharmaceutical sector is very good. But the problem is the UK actually does have a ton of regulatory freedom. The problem is the political will. I think in the US, it's the reverse. There's great political will, actually, to have a lot of regulatory reform, but the actual procedure, and especially the legal challenges that are often faced, is actually what can stymie regulatory reform.
Yeah, I see. It's so funny because I try to be, and I think I am, and both as a benefit and a detriment, to try to encourage greater deliberation. That's how we started the conversation. Of course, that greater deliberation could lead to it not happening and not happy. It's a paralysis by analysis, as they say. So let me get back to this. So, because we talked about you sort of making the transition from journalist to policy person at Reason, but were you always a small L libertarian, classical liberal, free market limited government type? How did you sort of come to this philosophy?
I always kind of was. I remember, growing up as a sort of teenager and, looking, through history and current affairs and being enormously admiring of what Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s, really turning around the UK economy, which really was the sick man of Europe. I mean, just this unrecognizable basket case. It was the most nationalized and socialized country outside of the communist bloc. And within what is really actually a short period of time, I mean, really 10 years, just turns it around.
Right.
And then the UK per capita becomes richer than France. And I would say, well, actually, changes in public policy, you really can change the welfare of people. You can change how much prosperity there is, how much freedom there is. The class system in the UK, which was very, very rigid and rampant, was totally opened up by Mrs. Thatcher's reforms. And I thought, well, these ideas, these policies, something's happening here, and they're based on a broader view of economics, of human flourishing, and so on. So I was inspired by that. And then, I went around, think tanks in the UK that, like the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Adam Smith Institute, and you have even, larger and greater ones here in the United States. And I thought this is a movement I want to be a part of to try and increase human freedom, flourishing, well-being, and prosperity.
It occurs to me, as we're recording this, the reason weekend's coming up. Are you going? Is that happening?
Unfortunately, I'm not going. I'm incredibly jealous of all my colleagues. I think they're going down to Austin for Reason Weekend, where they'll have the great bash. I know Nick's going to be down there.
Yeah, I'm not going. It's so funny because I was trying to meet with somebody in DC later this week, and was going to Reason Weekend. I'm like, oh man, nuts! I'm so jealous. You're such a fun organization, great group of people to be a part of. Let me ask you this. I asked this of everybody who comes on. If I hadn't done, I do 3 podcasts now. Nobody should do 3 podcasts. I at one point was contemplating doing a podcast that I was calling Outside Interests, which was about literally folks who do this kind of work, the stuff that they do that isn't related to politics or public policy. When you're not doing this kind of research, when you're not doing this kind of writing, what are you up to? What are some of your outside interests?
I'm essentially an old man trapped in a young man's body. That nice. Describes my interest. So one, I was at home last night with a martini, as I often am, with my wife, and we're watching a great series. You might remember, it's Kenneth Clark's Civilizations.
Oh, sure.
Civilization, back from the 1970s. Amazing series.
Wow.
So art and culture, we love all of that. I love poker. Poker is a passion of mine. Perhaps not surprising for somebody who works at Reason, has an affinity to cards, risk, and gambling, and comparative risk assessment. We got to know who's holding the cards, who's running a bluff. So poker, great television, old music, films from the 30s and 40s and the golden age of Hollywood. That's old man tastes. That's what I'll say.
It's so funny. I brought this up when I was in Liverpool because I'm a huge Beatles fan. And I'm a George. George is my favorite Beatle. That being said, I asked around. I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar with the Bowery Boys or the Dead End Kids?
I've heard of it.
All right. So every Saturday morning, just before 8:30 on Turner Classic Movies, they play the Bowery Boys. It's a group of guys. Started off as teenagers. They were in a movie called Angels with Dirty Faces, and then they did a couple of series. It's like the Three Stooges or Abbott and Costello or the Marx Brothers. But the point is, one of the characters speaks in these malapropisms. And I'm convinced that John Lennon was a huge fan of the Bowery Boys. In fact, on the Sgt. Pepper cover, the 2 primary Bowery Boys, Leo Gorcey and Huntz Hall, were Leo Gorcey objected to having his visage on the Sgt. Pepper cover. Anyway, I totally get that. Last night was scrolling through what the new releases were on TCM to watch that. Sorry you're not going to be at Reason Weekend, Guy, but how do folks find out more about the good work you're doing, the good work that Reason is doing?
Absolutely. They can come on to reason.org, which is the Reason Foundation website, where, I'm covering the sort of consumer freedom issues, all the sort of vice issues that folks might be interested in. But we're also looking at transportation, education, pensions. I mean, a lot of the sort of like very, very heavy hitting stuff, particularly in the States, which is where a lot of our focus is, because that's where we can actually quickly, hopefully, get things done. So reason.org for all the good stuff that Reason Foundation is doing. Hopefully we're going to have a good year this year in state session. And people can find me on x.com at with the very exciting original handle of @GBentley1.
I like that. That's good stuff. Well, Guy, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Guy Bentley is the Director of Consumer Freedom Research at the Reason Foundation. Anyway, if you're watching this, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel, you can always check out the Lunch Hour on the many fine podcast platforms, wherever you get your fine podcast content or not so fine podcast content. If you are listening to us, you can see what's happening in the studio by checking out our YouTube channel. Please subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment, send us a note, and let your friends and family members' friends know all about how much you're enjoying the Lunch Hour. I'm your host. I'm Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.